Hello and welcome to Upstack America's Oracle EBS Financials Functional Training. My name is Bob and I'm your lead senior consultant. And with me, I have Victor, who is also a senior consultant. And today we are handling accounts payables lesson 3. Victor, please walk us through.
Thanks, Bob, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this lesson in our Oracle Financials Functional Training series. We are looking at accounts payables, but before that, we said that we are going to look at the concept of multiple organizations access control, which is used in AP and also other sub-ledger modules. So we are going to look at this to get an idea of what we are dealing with before we go into the actual setups for our AP application. In our previous lesson, we talked about the various system entities or organizations that Oracle has created in the suite of applications, and how these entities help businesses of various nature to represent themselves in the ERP system and to reflect how they are actually organized in the real world. Okay, so we talked about each of these in short and what they are. We talked about how the business group is the highest level of classification. We are already familiar with legal entities and ledgers. In AP, we are going to be dealing a lot with operating units, and in our setup, we are also going to have to deal with inventory organizations. Okay. So we looked at, we talked about the operating unit, and we said that the operating unit is basically an organization which uses sub-ledger modules, okay, so such as AP, AR, cash management. We also have purchasing and order management. And we said that this organization in the real world is the one that actually transacts with vendors and customers, okay. And we also mentioned that the operating unit basically works the way the ledger works in the GL module, whereby it is used to segregate that data at the sub-ledger level. So, for example, in this scenario, if this legal entity, which is would want to segregate its sub-ledger data, which includes things like customer information, maybe, or other financial, or just the financial transactions taking place in each of these operating units, then it would implement separate operating units, and the users who have access to this operating unit will not be able to access the data stored in this operating unit. We, however, said that in R12, in release 12 of Oracle, we are also able to have a scenario whereby legal entities can share the same operating unit. So if the client who you're doing the implementation for has no need to separate data coming from these two different legal entities, or data owned by these two legal entities, then they can use one operating unit. So we're just going to talk about our operating units in a bit more detail so that we can have a much clearer understanding of what they are and where they fall in this whole implementation of AP and other sub-ledgers, because we are going to use them in other sub-ledger modules too. So we have already said that an operating unit is an organization that uses Oracle subledgers such as AP, AR, and cash management, order management, or purchasing. Now, depending on the kind of business it is, in the real world, the operating unit could be a department, it could be a sales office, or even maybe in the case of something like a worldwide deployment of Oracle, an operating unit could represent an actual registered company. So this comes back to the point where we say that this multi-org, these organizations or these system entities that we've talked about, they help different kinds of businesses which might use the Oracle ERPs or the Oracle EBS applications to represent themselves in the system, regardless of of the differences that might occur in the real world. Okay, so that's why we are saying if a company, for example, is a multinational, then its operating unit could represent a company in one country and have another operating unit representing another registered company in a different country. But if a business is just based in one country, then in that case, an operating unit could represent just maybe a sales office in one state, or even a sales office in one part of the city and another sales office in another part of the city. So operating unit doesn't represent, it can represent different things in the real world, but basically all of those real world entities are places where financial transactions take place, i.e. places where these subledger modules are being used, because these subledger modules are the ones that support where the financial transactions with clients, with customers, and with vendors are recorded. When we are implementing operating units, we associate them with ledgers and a default legal context. So we don't associate them directly with a legal entity. We associate them with a ledger and a default legal context. So when you create your operating unit, you will specify it under a certain ledger, and you'll also assign it a default legal context or a legal entity, but not directly to the legal entity. That might sound a bit more confusing, but maybe if you think about it this way, we have talked about a situation where two legal entities can use the same operating unit. Now, these two legal entities will be on the same ledger, right? So for example, in our setup, we have Maskani developers and Maskani property managers, okay? So if we create one operating unit which will be used by both of them, then we'll assign it to the ledger, because these legal entities are also associated with that single ledger. So basically, that's what it means, or that's why we can say that we associate operating units with the ledger and then a default legal context, and not directly to a legal entity. Because if we assign it directly to a legal entity, then it means we won't be able to implement a situation such as this, or a scenario such as this, whereby legal entities share the same operating unit. And we know that this is a situation that actually occurs in the real world, where two different registered entities or legal companies, they are sharing the same operating unit. So what is the purpose of operating units? We have mentioned this also, but operating units, they segregate data at the sub-ledger level, just the way that the ledger in the GL module is used to segregate information. Then the sub-ledger data is segregated using operating units. Operating units also help with compliance to regulations, because within the operating units you can define things such as transaction types, which also affect things like the taxes that are paid on these transactions. So operating units can help companies organize themselves in this way. So for example, maybe sales tax in one state is collected differently to sales tax in another state. So for your operations in different states, you might want to have different operating units so that you can manage things like those within the context of the operating unit. And then the other function we can talk about is they are used to secure data through responsibilities. And this is also the same way that we use ledgers through the data access set to separate ledger information. So you assign operating units to a certain responsibility, which you then give to a user. So a user who is logged into one responsibility will view data only in the operating unit to which they have access. However, we also have this multiple organization access control, which we keep mentioning. And we said that when we talk about multi-org, we are basically referring to the fact that we have a feature. Oracle allows us to assign access to multiple operating units through a single responsibility. So when we say multi-organization access control, we're basically saying we have the ability to assign multiple operating units to one responsibility. So even when you have maybe a situation such as this, where we have separate operating units and users who have access to this operating unit cannot see what is stored in this operating unit, we can also have maybe a user who has access to this two operating units. And basically, just by the fact that we have more than one operating unit, then that means we are talking about multiple organizations. Okay, so now we understand what operating units are and their functions and what we mean by multiple organization access control. Operating units, they usually send accounting information to the general ledger, okay? Remember, we have said that operating unit is basically an organization where sub-ledger modules, Oracle sub-ledger modules are utilized, okay? And sub-ledgers, what they do is that they support the general ledger, okay? So for example, payables, which is the purchase ledger, okay? Purchasing ledger, which records purchasing transactions and also vendor information. Then we have receivables, which records sales transactions and customer information, and cash management, which has information on banks and all that. So we know that periodically these subledger modules, they usually send accounting information to the general ledger. And then we generate reports from the general ledger using all this accounting information. So basically what we are saying is that accounting information is usually sent to general ledger from the operating units. Now we have this concept of legal entity stamping, whereby the operating unit is basically, we can say it's working for the legal entity, okay? Because this operating unit is basically taking part, is doing transactions for the legal entity. This is where the trades with the outside world for the legal entity take place, right? So even when we are doing the reporting, we are doing reports for the legal entity or for the company. So in a scenario such as this, whereby legal entities share the same operating unit, then legal entity stamping will indicate the owner of the financial transactions when they are being transferred to the general ledger. Okay, so for example, it will say that this information or these transactions are owned by legal entity 1, or these transactions are owned by legal entity 2. So that's what we mean when we talk about legal entity stamping. Okay. So now let's move on to the next thing that we wanted to talk about, which is the business group. Again, we've said that the business group is the highest level of classification of organizations that we can have in the Oracle EBS suite of applications. Business group is usually set up and configured in the Oracle Human Resources module. And the purpose is basically that the business group is used for administering human resource payroll and employee benefits. So a business group can be as huge as country specific. So we will find even that in Oracle we have some predefined business group that represent specific countries, okay? So for example, if a company is a multinational, and so they will have employees in maybe the US, they'll have employees in Canada, they'll have employees in Kenya. So you can set up business group for each of those country level jurisdictions. And those business groups, they contain like legal, and also you can specify administrative regulations for that particular business group. And the reason why we say it's the highest level of classification, because a business group can contain employees who work for different legal entities, okay? So maybe you have in the US, you have like 3 different registered companies, but all those companies and their employees, you can put them within one business group. So why are we talking about the business group when we're talking about AP? So when you're setting up AP, you have to specify the business group. And the reason why you do this is because this employee information, it determines which employees you can use and see in your AP modules, okay? So that's why you have to associate your operating unit with a business group. And that way, then we'll be able to determine the employees who can use your particular AP operating or your particular operating unit. There are also other features in AP that require employee information. So things such as expense reports, and then you have work approval hierarchies. So for example, maybe before a payment is made, it has to be approved by a certain person or manager of a certain seniority. Then you will require to have that employee information, so that then you can see that that manager is allowed to make those approvals or something like that. So you can, depending on the needs of the client, then you can define the required number of business groups. Of course, this is something that's going to be done by the guys who are working on the human resource side, right? So they need to set up the business group required by the client for whom you're doing the implementation. But Oracle also provides this default value, which is called the setup business group. And you can use this as the default if you don't have to define different business groups, and if you are not using Oracle Human Resources. But according to Oracle, it is important to define a business group, and it is recommended you set up the business group initially before you even set up your operating units. And the other thing is that you cannot set up your business group once you go live, okay? So you have to do this setup at the very beginning. So now let's look at the big picture of all those things that we have talked about, all those system entities and organizations that we have talked about, and how they are associated with each other. So here we have our GL module, which can contain one or more ledgers, right? Here we have our legal entities. Legal entities, it's a legal construct which represents the company or whatever kind of organization it is, or partnership that has been set up in, has been registered with the government. Here we have our sub-ledgers, which support our general ledger, okay? And we know that sub-ledger data is segregated by operating units, just the way data in the general ledger is separated through the ledgers or the data access set. And then finally here we have the HR, where employee information is separated through business groups. So if you log in, also this is also assigned through responsibilities, just like all these others. So if a responsibility is assigned this business group, then when you log into this business group, you won't be able to see the employees in business group 2. So this is how all these features are associated. So you assign your operating unit a particular business group. So in this case, we have 2 separate operating units and 2 separate business groups. So each operating unit is associated with a business group, and therefore you can only use or see the employee information for their respective associated business groups. Up here, this legal entity 1 is associated with operating unit 1, and legal entity 2 is associated with operating unit 2. So that means when operating unit 2 is taking care of the financial transaction, or it's the one that's dealing with the customers for legal entity 2, and the same thing for operating unit 1. It's the one that's dealing with the customers for legal entity 1. Now, just as we have seen, we can have more than one legal entity assigned to one ledger. And basically, what the relationship between the legal entity and the ledger is that the legal entity accounts for itself in the ledger, right? We run reports. From the general ledger. These reports belong to these legal entities or the companies in the real world. So that's the association. So if you want to see the reports or the financial information for legal entity 1, you go to the ledger and you run your reports. Same thing for legal entity 2. The association between operating units and the ledger is that the operating units, which are basically the places where subledger modules are used, they send accounting information to the general ledger, right? So we know about that accounting info is usually transferred to GL from the subledger modules, or basically from the operating units. So in this is how we create associations between all these organizations, okay? So that is the big picture. You can try and like master this particular slide because it basically contains all the information of how all these organizations relate to each other. Anyway, so that's where we are going to end this session for now. So Bob, unless you have something to add.
Thank you, Victor. You're good.
Thank you.